In Romans 8, verse 31, we read, God says, I am greater than anything that can come against you. There may be some of you at the moment that have issues that you're dealing with, financial, relationship, whatever it may be, and you just think that there's no way out. Just think of the Israelites, how tough it was for them for 400 years being under the slavery under the Egyptians. We've been following the whole story of Moses, and I hope that it was encouraging for you. Good morning, welcome to Renee Joubert Ministries. And today we're going to continue with Moses, and I'm going to end the series on today's teaching. So what we have seen so far is that God is showing his power to the children of Israel. He used the plagues to show and demonstrate that the gods of Egypt is useless and worthless and cannot do anything. They can't save the Israelites, and they could most definitely not save the Egyptians either. The plagues was there to put judgment on the gods of Egypt, to show the children of Israel that God can not only protect them, but also look after them. Except for the last one, when the firstborn would die. On that one, God was testing the Israelites as well. All the other plagues was just pointed at the Egyptians. But this last one, they had to prove their faith. Because by faith, they had to paint blood of the lamb on the door frames. And if they didn't do it, their firstborn would die, man or beast. And it is during this that Pharaoh, when he loses his son and all the Egyptians are crying, he tells the people of Israel, off you go, out of my sight, I don't want to see you. Now it's time for the long journey. So God kept his promise. Every time he said something will happen, he did. God promised Moses that he will save the children. He did promise Moses that Pharaoh will harden his heart. But God also said, I will show my power, which is what he does. And this is almost now the high point of this whole story, when we see how the children of Israel can now go out to go serve the Lord. God has been teaching them all this time how to obey and how to follow him. So now they are ready to exit Egypt. Interesting here that how people try to say, well, it didn't really happen and it's just a story. Well, there's more than enough proof that it did happen. And there's no ways that you can water it down or even make out that it didn't happen. This was an amazing story from the beginning, from Moses being saved, the burning bush, all the plagues. God's power has no end. When we look at Exodus 12 verse 37, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides the women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. So this must have been quite an impressive crowd. If you then add the women and the children, there probably was close to 2 million people following Moses out of Egypt. Now, there's been many different maps that I've found, but there's one that I found that I think is the most accurate one, because I think it's also important that we see where they journeyed. One of the things that people trying to say is that they didn't die, that they didn't go through the sea, that it was no big deal, it was only through shallow water that they went. Now that can't be true, because we also know that it couldn't have happened near what's now known today as Kairu, because they traveled a longer journey. Also, how can 600 selected chariots, around 200,000 foot soldiers and 50,000 horsemen die in shallow water? We need to look at our map now to understand exactly where they parted the Red Sea. And you will see on my map that the Red Sea is like two fingers. The one side on the left, if you look at the map, is the Gulf of the Suez, and that is where and that is not where they parted. And then on the right hand side, you see Yam Suf. Now, this is where they said that if you look at the translation of Yam, it means also reeds. But reeds don't grow in seawater. Now, if it was reeds, you could understand that they may have go through near Geshem, where they used to live. But that's too close. It's definitely sure that they traveled for 3 days, because there was a pillar of the fire and there was a pillar of cloud that was with them. So if you take that for 3 days, that will take, and they went through the wilderness. We'll look at those passages now. That would take them all the way to Yam Suf. And that is the wilderness. They also, we will read that they didn't go to the top where the Philistines are, because God said if they will go through that area, they may want to turn back because of war. The Philistines were not very nice people. So let's look at, so the place where the Israelite cross was Aqaba, the finger there, and the right finger of the Red Sea. Yam Suf is also mentioned 24 times in the Old Testament, and that's another determination that that is where they went through, or proof. So Exodus 13 verse 17 says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Also in verse 18, important, but God led the people around by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Now we know they're on their way to the Mount Sinai, because that is also where Moses had near the Mount Sinai, where Moses had the encounter with God with a burning bush. So they're on their way there. And now we can read in Galatians 4 verse 25. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. So we now know that the Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia, and that's giving us another clue of where they went. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, where she's slavery with her children. So the Red Sea crossing wasn't immediately, because they traveled. Another reason is that in Exodus 12 verse 50, they had enough time for the men then to be circumcised. Another miracle by God, because they were still physically strong enough to continue their journey. Now the place where they crossed is now called Nuweiba Beach. And it is possible that this is exactly where they crossed for a few reasons. First of all, it's a big enough and large enough area so that 2.5, 3 million people could camp out, and they were surrounded by mountains. The other clue there is that archaeologists has found artifacts here to prove it, wheels and the metal parts holding the spokes, coral growing over it. Now coral can't grow in sand, it needs something solid like rocks and objects, which isn't here. The only objects that was there was the metal parts that they found from the wheels. Also here, the ocean bed is quite smooth, and it's got a gradual slope down and one up again for about 10.5 miles. So it's a perfect path. And in Isaiah 51 verse 10, it says it was great water, so it couldn't have been shallow. And we also see in Kings 9 verse 26 that King Solomon's fleet of ships was in these waters. So this is enough proof for us to know that they didn't travel through shallow water. It was actually deep water, and some reckon up to 2 meters high. So in verse 14, verse 9, we see that the Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army. So that's why we know that it was quite a big group of Egyptian soldiers, because there were 600 chariots, there was horsemen and an army. So that's why we look at the figures. So it was at least 500,000 of soldiers following them and overtook them, encamped at the sea by Pi Hahiroth and Baal Zephon. Don't know if that's said correct. But the children of Israel were feared when they were chased by these men. Even Moses cries out to the Lord, He forgot that he was holding the power. And that is, for me, it really struck me when I was reading this. Moses forgot that he had the power in his hand, that God gave him the power through his rod. Remember, he was throwing it on the ground and it turned into a snake. He put it in the water and it turned into blood. He used his rod all the times, and yet here he forget that he has that power. Made me think that often we forget that power that we have now in us because of the grace of God, because of what Jesus Christ did on the cross for us. We have the power to overcome anything that's thrown at us. We have no excuse. We just have to use that power and realize we've got it. So then Moses put his staff over the water, and then there came a huge, great wind over the east, which is from the desert side, the Saudi side, and it was a dry wind. So it separated the sea so that it had these high walls on the left and on the right, almost like it iced up on the sides. So God then led them through with a pillar of fire, and from behind a cloud, a big cloud, which caused darkness, and the Egyptians caught up and was confused. And in the middle of the path, when Israel was safe on the other side, the water closed down, and Pharaoh's men drowned in the middle. Whether Pharaoh drowned with his men, whether he was on the side, I don't know. But I think he was arrogant enough to take the lead. He disliked the Israelites so much that I'm sure he also drowned. Now let's see what it says in the book. Exodus 14 verse 23. And the Egyptians, this is the Amplified Version, and the Egyptians pursued them into the middle of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his war chariots, and his charioteers. So it happened at the early morning watch. So this was before dawn. That's why the Israelites was led by the fire. That the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and put them in a state of confusion. He made their chariot wheels hard to turn and the chariots difficult to drive. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." And many nations is going to see this. Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians. Well, that is still true for today. But now we can say, let us flee from this child of God, because the Lord is fighting him or her, fights for her. Keep that in mind. The Lord is fighting your battles for you. Leave it at the cross. You do not have to carry the burden. So God leads the enemy to a point where there's no return and where they actually realized, too late though, that He is the Lord, He's the God, He is the only one, and He's above all gods. So Zephaniah says in Zephaniah 3 verse 17 says, because when the Israelites got to the other side, they glorified the Lord. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exalt you over you with loud singing. And Deuteronomy 31 verse 8, it is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Yes, as Christians we will still face difficulty, but He's with us. He goes before you. The problem is that His timing is not always as quick as what we would like it to be. We're going to have to be patient. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 10. For the sake of Christ then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When we're weak is when we humble ourselves and we go to the Lord. And we allow Him to fight our fights for us. And because we know that, then that puts us in peace. And that puts us in a time of rest, and that is when we are strong, when we don't worry, when we don't stress, when we don't cry, because we know our God is bigger and more powerful than anything we would ever face. I hope this is encouraging you. Whenever you have doubt about your circumstances, just look at Moses and what God did for his children, and what he did for the children of Israel, he is also doing for you today. God is great, he's able, and he's willing, and he loves you so much. He will not allow anything to jeopardize that. You just have to trust him, have faith, and believe in him. Please follow us, and next week we're going to look at David. I'll be on Rumble, YouTube, and on Facebook. God loves you. I love you. Have a great week.